They crossed in that deep twilight a broad volcanic plain bounded within the rim of hills. The hills were a deep blue in the blue dusk, and the round feet of the pony clopped flatly on the gravel of the desert floor. The night was falling down from the east, and the darkness that passed over them came in a sudden breath of cold and stillness and passed on, as if the darkness had a soul itself that was the sun's assassin, hurrying to the west as once men did believe, as they may believe again. They rode up off the plain in the final dying light, man and wolf and horse, over a terrace land of low hills much eroded by wind, and they crossed through a fence line or crossed where a fence line once had been. The wires long down and rolled and carried off, and the little naked mesquite posts wandering single file away into the night like an enfilade of bent and twisted pensioners. They rode through the pass in the dark, and there he sat the horse and watched the lightning to the south, far over the plains of Mexico. The wind was thrashing softly through the trees in the pass, and in the wind were spits of sleet. He made his camp in the lee of an arroyo south of the pass, and gathered wood, and made a fire, and gave the wolf all the water she would drink. Then he tied her to the washed-out elbow of a cottonwood and walked back and unsaddled and hobbled the horse. He unrolled the blanket and threw it over his shoulders and took the moquila and went and sat before the fire. The wolf sat on her haunches below him in the draw and watched him with her intractable eyes so red in the firelight. From time to time she would bend to try the bindings on her leg with her side teeth, but she could not grip them for the stick in her jaws. He took a sandwich of steak and light bread from the moquila and unwrapped it and sat eating. The little fire sawed about in the wind, and the fine sleet fell slant upon them out of the darkness and hissed in the coals. He ate and watched the wolf. She pricked her ears and turned and looked out at the night, but whatever was passing passed, and after a while she stood and looked bleakly at the ground that was not of her choosing, and circled 3 times and lay down facing the fire with her tail over her nose. He woke all night with a cold. He'd rise and mend back the fire, and she was always watching him. When the flames came up, her eyes burned out there like gate lamps to another world, a world burning on the shore of an unknowable void, a world construed of blood and blood's alkahest, and blood in its core, in its integument, because it was nothing, save blood had power to resonate against the void that threatened hourly to devour it. He wrapped himself in the blanket and watched her. When those eyes and the nation to which they stood witness were gone at last with their dignity back into their origins, there would perhaps be other fires and other witnesses and other worlds otherwise beheld. But they would not be this one. The last few hours before the dawn, he did sleep, cold or no. He rose in the gray light and pulled the blanket about him and knelt and tried to blow life into the dead ashes of the fire. He walked out to where he could watch the east for sunrise. A mottled scud of clouds lay across the neutral desert sky. The wind had abated, and the dawn was soundless. When he approached the wolf holding the canteen, she did not bridle or arch her back at him. He touched her, and she edged away. He held her by the collar and pushed her down, and sat trickling the water between her teeth while her tongue worked and her gullet jerked, and the cold slant eye watched his hand. He held his hand under her jaw at the far side to save the water running on the ground, and she drank the canteen dry. He sat stroking her. Then he reached down and felt her belly. She struggled and her eyes rolled wildly. He spoke to her softly. He put the flat of his hand between her warm and naked teats. He held it there for a long time. Then he felt something move. When he set out across the valley to the south, the grass was golden in the morning sun. Antelope were grazing on the plain a half-mile to the east. He looked back to see if she had taken notice of them, but she had not. She limped along behind the horse, steadfast and dog-like, and in this fashion they crossed sometime near noon the international boundary line into Mexico, state of Sonora, undifferentiated in its terrain from the country they quit, and yet wholly alien and wholly strange. He sat the horse and looked out over the red hills. To the east he could see one of the concrete obelisks that stood for a boundary marker. In that desert waste it had the look of some monument to a lost expedition. 2 hours later they'd left the valley and begun to climb through the low hills, sparse grass, and ocotillo. A few thin cattle trotted off before them. By and by they struck the Cajon Bonita, which was the main trail south through the mountains, and by the side of this track, an hour later, they came upon a small rancho. He sat the horse and pulled the wolf close to him by the rope, and he called out and waited to see if dogs would show, but none did. He rode slowly. There were 3 crumbling adobe houses, and a man dressed in rags stood in the doorway of one of them. The place had the look of an old way station fallen into ruin. He rode forward and halted in front of the man, and sat with his hands crossed at the wrists and resting on the pommel of his saddle. That was a selection from Cormac McCarthy's The Crossing, read by Zachary Mann Brown.